Just tell me, will he live or die? Colonel Santosh Yashwant Mahadik. Sabah, Jammu and Kashmir, the 16th of November 2015. Papa Jaldi Aao. Hum wait Karanj. Papa, return soon. We will be waiting for you. Kartiki Mahadik, 11 years old, threw her arms around her father's neck. It was near midnight that night in May 2015. Kartiki's little brother, Swaraj, waved from behind her. Their father was headed, with a group of his men, to Muri, not far away, where a group of terrorists who had infiltrated across the lock had been spotted. Kartiki was old enough to wonder why her father, the CEO of the 41 Rashtriya Rifles, needed to personally lead every operation into the beautiful, unforgiving forests of North Kashmir that surrounded his field headquarters. She was old enough to know that battalion bosses were not required to physically front every mission, but play the nerve center with command and control. Yet she never once wondered. Which is why 8 months later, when Col. Santosh Yashwant Mahadik phoned his wife, Swati, then staying 300 kilometers away at the Army's Northern Command headquarters in Udhampur, she didn't blink. It was freezing that night of the 16th of November 2015. Col. Mahadik and a team of his men had dashed by road from Kupwara to a thick sector of forests in the frontier hamlet of Sabah. It was the red alert the colonel had been waiting for. Over the first half of November, along with the first snow, the trail of a small group of terrorists wearing white snow jackets and bearing suspiciously heavy backpacks had gone cold. They had been spotted by civilian porters on the 3rd of November in Trumna, a village within the 41 Rashtriya Rifles area of responsibility. Rushing to the destination at Kamkari, the porters had immediately notified officers at the 57 Rashtriya Rifles unit headquartered there about the suspicious men in snow gear. The men they saw were definitely not locals, the porters insisted, before they went on their way. An officer at the 57 Rashtriya Rifles immediately relayed the tip-off to Col. Mahadik's unit, advising him to make preparations to intercept the suspicious group of men as they came down the Shamshabari mountains. The CEO of the 41 Rashtriya Rifles immediately deployed teams to place ambushes along points near the range. For 3 days, the men searched, patrolled and waited. A fresh batch of snow, several feet deep, fell on the 7th of November, 4 days after the hunt had begun. The soldiers were then redeployed on surveillance missions in the area. 2 days later, on the afternoon of the 9th of November, fresh intelligence reached Col. Mahadik's men that a body had been recovered from Trumna, the village where the suspects had first been spotted. As always, the colonel rushed to the site himself. The body had clearly been dumped there. The dead man's weapon, an AK-47, lay by his side on the banks of a thin stream. A closer inspection revealed that the man's legs had rotted from gangrene. Speaking to his contacts among Trumna's locals, Col. Mahadik made a quick deduction. The dead man was likely from the same group that had been spotted by the porters 3 days earlier. Snowfall and frostbite had clearly got to them. The 4 suspects had probably passed through the village, and this one man had been left behind because he could walk no further. He had then probably died in the care of someone ordered to look after him. Locals, fearing they would be held responsible for harboring a terrorist, then probably dumped the body outside the settlement in a nala so sniffer dogs would not be able to detect it. The sighting of the corpse was confirmation that at least 3 others in the group had survived and were moving towards the Kashmir Valley. On the 10th of November, Col. Mahadik launched operations at 2 sites, Kupwara's Managar and Baramulla's Jugshal. Meticulous patrolling through snowbound forests and ridgelines revealed nothing. The hunt continued for 48 hours. At 0800 hours on the 13th of November, Col. Mahadik received word that one of the suspects had descended from a jungle and entered a hamlet near Trumna to ask for food. Teams were rushed to the spot, but they were too late. The suspect had collected food and was already headed back up towards the jungles. Locals showed the army team the direction in which he had gone. Following the trail up the hill, soldiers noticed someone attempting to conceal himself with a shawl. It was a hill track frequented by people from the village. When challenged, the man in the shawl turned around, revealing an assault rifle and opened a burst of fire. The spray of bullets hit 2 Jawans, injuring them. As the army team took cover, the weather and visibility worsened abruptly, bringing fresh rain and snow, allowing the man to escape. Over the next 2 days, the team searched grimly for the man who had got away. By the 15th of November, the team was exhausted after an uninterrupted phase of combat alert, and their morale had dipped considerably. They had effectively been on the hunt for 7 days and achieved nothing. Troubled but determined, the men were asked to return to their headquarters. As they moved back from the location, another group of soldiers took the place to continue the hunt, this time in the adjoining hamlet of Sabaya. The team, from the 160 Territorial Army Battalion, began scouring forests near the village. The 160 TARC, comprising infantry soldiers, looked after intelligence operations and was co-located with Col. Mahadik's 41 Rashtriya rifles. The unit had been deployed just to make sure nothing was amiss. But as they entered the area on the night of the 16th of November, they walked right into a fire trap. A soldier in the party, Rifleman Muhammad, received a gunshot straight in the leg, and the team was now pinned down by sustained fire from at least 2 quarters. The sun had set, and the clatter of Kalashnikov fire echoed through the forests that night. Back in Kupwara, Col. Mahadik was getting ready to meet local officials as part of Operation Sadbhavna, the army's ambitious mission to build bridges and, as the government officially states, win the hearts and minds of the local population. At 2000 hours, he received word about the contact that had been made in the general area of Sabaya village. Col. Mahadik summoned his men, which included a few J&K Police Special Operations Group Jawans, climbed into his vehicle and sped towards Sabaya. He and his teams reached the area and formed a wide cordon to hem the suspects in. Col. Mahadik climbed to a vantage point and established a quick surveillance post that often proves crucial in such operations. He needed to ensure that the entire area could be seen. His weapon ready and the cordon in force, they carefully extracted injured Rifleman Muhammad from the forest and transported him to safety. Up in his perch, the colonel spent an uncomfortable, cold night, his gaze scanning the swathe of dark, nebulous forest before him. Early the next morning, on the 17th of November, army reinforcements had been called in to join the hunt. Now an infantryman, Col. Mahadik had a special strength urging him on. He was a commando himself, originally from an elite para-SF unit. In 2003, he had earned a Sainar Medal for bravery in action against the United Liberation Front of Assam terrorists in the northeast. 12 years later, he had volunteered to lead a counterinsurgency unit in the restive Kashmir Valley. He knew what the Paras brought to any fight. They were most welcome. As the search continued with renewed aggression, Col. Mahadik received a call on his cell phone. It was from a local source, one of many he had cultivated as friends during his time in the valley. The voice at the other end of the line kept it brief. One suspect had come down a hill in the Kashmiri Managar area nearby and requested food from villagers there. The colonel had no reason to doubt the information he had just been supplied. And once again, with his men deployed in the active operation, he decided to act on the information himself. He gathered half of his quick reaction team QRT, and the J&K police Jawans who had accompanied him, jumped into 2 squad vehicles and made straight for Managar. When they arrived, it became clear that the suspect had headed back up the mountainside and into the jungles. Col. Mahadik reconnected with his source from the ground. There was more information. The suspect likely had at least 2 more men for company up in the jungles. The officer smelt the end of an operation that had stretched for a full 2 weeks now. The 14 men were quickly split into 2 teams of 7 and sent in 2 different directions to begin the search. The terrain was familiar and taxing. A Nala cascaded down the mountainside, with ridge lines ascending on both sides. An hour-long search revealed nothing. The teams patrolled along the Nala on their way back to the village. Just outside the village, they stopped for a quick break to plan their next move. It was there that one of them spotted it. A bottle of mineral water, its top half cut off to make a tumbler, Saturday precariously on a rock. Next to it was a battered cooking utensil with some freshly cooked food, rice and meat. Commanded by Col. Mahadik, the men immediately took cover positions. 2 things were immediately and disturbingly clear. The suspects were definitely nearby. That was the good news. They had likely abandoned the precious food because they had spotted the army team, and were therefore almost certainly in a position of advantage. It was an extremely tense situation. We had no time to readjust. We needed to quickly make our next move, or we stood the risk of being ambushed and massacred, remembers a Jawan who was in the team that morning. Mahadik wasted no time. He quickly sent one half of the team up the ridgeline to gain a vantage position, crucial to a situation where they didn't know where a burst of fire would come from. Mahadik and his team of 7 moved laterally across the ridgeline. As they did so, one of the police Jawans noticed a black Ferran behind a tall bush right ahead. He held the colonel back, pointing straight ahead and alerting him to 2 men hiding behind the foliage. The men were ordered to cock their weapons and pull the chain levers on their rifles to a rapid mode, which allowed for a burst of fire. Single shots weren't going to be of use in this fight. As the team inched forward, one of the terrorists abruptly changed position. The other remained where he was, stopping in his tracks, and motioning to the other men to stand back. Mahadik raised his weapon and fired a few rounds directly at the bush. 4 of his men were in cover fire positions, while 3 stood with him as he fired. But it was the other terrorist, who had shifted position moments earlier, who fired back. And this was from a position the colonel and the 3 men next to him didn't have their eyes on. A hail of rifle rounds tore through him as he fell to the ground. Nobody could see where the firing had come from. The 3 men with Mahadik were in the open and totally vulnerable. They dropped onto their bellies, waiting for a certain follow-up volley of bullets. The CO knew that if he didn't act fast, his men would be butchered in the open. Despite his gunshot wounds, Mahadik crawled forward towards the ridgeline. Word about the CO having been shot hadn't yet reached the other teams. Because Mahadik was the one with the radio set, teams attempting to make contact with him thought he was silent so as not to alert the terrorists. With blood gushing from his many wounds, Mahadik heaved himself across the ridgeline to the other side. Hauling himself up over a rock, he opened fire on the positions where he assumed the terrorists were hiding. The bullets he fired didn't find the terrorists, but effectively pinned them to their positions. By firing continuously while still exposed and wounded, he basically ensured that the terrorists did not fire at the men behind him. He was running out of ammunition and began pacing his fire to keep the terrorists on the defensive for as long as possible so that his men could get to safety. By this time, other army teams had reached the location, but there was nobody to brief them on the situation because the CO was down. Desperate to make contact with the team up on the ridgeline, a havildar in charge of the QRT team called one of the police special operations group Jawans on his mobile phone. Saab ko goli lagi hai, sir has been shot, he reported back. It was the first information from the fight. The havildar rushed to the ridgeline where Mahadik lay. As the other men provided covering fire, he picked up the CO and carried him down the hill to a location 1.5 kilometers from the roadhead. Evacuation by helicopter wasn't possible because the Managa area was located in a narrow valley. Pale from blood loss, his body already turning cold, Mahadik was driven to the nearest site of hope, the 168 Military Hospital in Drugmala, just off the Sapor Kupwara highway. Doctors at the hospital quickly declared that they couldn't revive the colonel and suggested he be flown immediately to the Army's base hospital in Srinagar 85 kilometers away. While Mahadik was being airlifted to Srinagar, I received a call from his wife. She had already heard, remembers March. Praveen, then adjutant at 41 Rashtriya Rifles headquarters. Her question still haunts me. All she asked was Zinda range ya nahi range. Basitna bata do, will he live or not? Just tell me that. March. Praveen did not know what to say. He knew that she knew the truth. But he still hoped that the doctors at 92 Base Hospital, often magicians in their abilities, could bring Mahadik back. She called again a short while later. This time, she asked me a question that haunts me even more, remembers March. Praveen. She asked how many rounds had hit her husband. I mustered my strength to inform her that he had taken 7 bullets and that he was unlikely to survive. She said nothing further and hung up the phone. Mahadik was declared broad dead at the 92 Base Hospital in Srinagar. At the time this was written, Col. Mahadik's wife was at the officer's training academy in Chennai gearing up to become an army officer. Less than a year after her husband's passing, she decided she wanted to wear the olive green uniform. It was a difficult decision that forced her to send her 2 young children away to boarding schools in Maharashtra and Uttarakhand. Like they never did when their father picked up his weapon and ventured out at night, Kartiki and Swaraj never once wondered why their mother, well past the age to be a cadet, has decided to be an army officer. We didn't think this was the right way forward. But she is an incredibly courageous lady. She wishes to take her husband's unfinished work forward, says March. Praveen, who continues to be deployed in the Kashmir Valley. The colonel's unfinished work has nothing to do with the terrorists who managed to escape that day. They were perhaps only incidental to a larger mission he had assumed for himself in a beautiful and dangerous land. His business was war, but accounts of what Col. Mahadik was engaged with in Kupwara suggest he was looking to sow every last bit of goodness he possibly could in the terrain and the people around him. From sessions on inspirational leadership for children in Kupwara to yoga camps and lessons in adventure tourism, Col. Mahadik took the task of winning the hearts and minds of people as seriously as he took his fighting. Described by his men and peers as a visionary, the army has spent the months since his demise studying the work he did in Kupwara. Warned by local leaders that yoga would not be accepted by the predominantly Muslim population, in 2014, the colonel decided to send a group of 15 citizens to Pune to attend a camp conducted by the Siddha Samadhi Yoga program. The group returned with a request that the organization set up a special camp in Kupwara. A group from Pune arrived shortly thereafter to conduct special sessions for children and local traders in Kupwara, with a promise to institutionalize yoga in the town. He had an outstanding rapport with Kupwara's citizens. He met locals very often and sometimes kept an open house. He did for Kupwara tourism what local government officials haven't even tried to, says an officer who was deployed with him at the 41 Rashtriya Rifles. March. Praveen concurs. Col. Mahadik never really believed that the military was a lasting solution in this area, and that we're only here temporarily. We must leave this beautiful land even better than we found it, he says. During his time in Kupwara, there was a discernible change in the public perception of the army, say men who served under the colonel. Separatists from the Hurriyat would often attack Col. Mahadik through the local media or through statements issued in public, recalls a Jawan of the 41 Rashtriya Rifles. They didn't like how he was reaching out to the locals and having an impact on their lives. They warned him to simply do his work and get out. All that never bothered him. Col. Mahadik's leadership by example would become legend well beyond his unit, and has already become a touchstone of what inspiring COs do. Even as a CO, he would go and sit in ambushes for 2 to 3 days, which is unusual for someone of his seniority and rank. He enjoyed being in the field with his men, says March. Praveen. He always said that every officer is a soldier, and every soldier is a leader. He truly believed that. He never differentiated between the two. Soldiers in his unit remember the unusual level of personal interest the colonel took in the well-being of men under his charge. They speak of a particular Jawan from Col. Mahadik's state, Maharashtra, who was distressed following bitter marital discord. As divorce proceedings began, Col. Mahadik invited the Jawan's wife and children to Kupwara, acquiring special permission from the army so they could stay on site for a month. Over that month, Col. Mahadik counseled the couple. The two decided not to separate and are still together. A few weeks later, the domestic problems of another Jawan were similarly resolved. It is very rare for officers to get so deeply involved in the personal lives of the soldiers. It earns them loyalty of a kind that cannot be put into words. March. Praveen says. 5 days after Col. Mahadik was lost, one of the terrorists was killed in an encounter with soldiers from the 160 Tarataji Naka. What became of the remaining 2 terrorists is as yet unknown. An image remains imprinted in the mind of an army officer who accompanied the family as Col. Mahadik's remains were transported by air from Udampa to Pune that November. Swaraj Saturday on the coffin, playing. He was too young to know what had happened, the officer remembers. He was oblivious. I just Saturday and watched him play.